Hi there, this is Catherine. Thanks you for listening to my SEO Tips micro podcast. So, before we get into today's SEO tip, I just wanted to share with you the ways you can support the podcast if you're enjoying all the tips and finding them useful. So, you can send me a donation at buymeacoffee.com/Catherine W. Ong, O-N-G, and that's Catherine with a K. Any and all levels of donation are appreciated. It will help me offset the cost of producing the podcast. So, that's buymeacoffee.com/Katherinewong. I'd also encourage you to subscribe to our email list to make sure you're not missing any future episodes or any other news about the SEO Tips podcast. And to do that, you'd go to wostrategies.com/newsletter. Okay, on with today's tip. Let's talk about why it's time to optimize your audio. Hello, and thanks for listening to SEO Tips today. So are you interested in optimizing your audio assets? If so, this episode is for you. Now, let's start off with how big podcasting has become. So 1/3 of US adults listen to podcasting a month. That's more people consuming podcasts than are on some of the major social media networks. And podcast listeners are an engaged audience, and 80% of them will listen to an entire podcast episode or most of it. So optimizing podcasts and audio assets for search is relatively new effort, I realize, but now it has even more focus from Google because Google's now starting to surface podcast landing pages and episodes in search. Now, I started paying attention to the trend when Google's podcasting team a couple of years ago announced that their new goal was to double the amount of podcast listeners in the next couple of years. I think that's a huge thing for podcasters and for marketers. So Google is now integrating and surfacing podcast content in Google Search and Google Assistant. And if you search for a popular podcast now, or even somebody who's been interviewed on a podcast, the Google results will display the episode, oftentimes a clickable carousel, so you can instantly play those episodes right in Google Search. So keep in mind that you probably are not going to see this in your SEO ranking tool. But let's talk a little bit about how you would rank in the various parts of Google. So ranking in Google's podcasting app. So Google particularly mentions that the following comes into play when it comes to selecting and ranking audio content in its app. Popularity, inclusion of evergreen content relevant to the listener, or exclusion of news content if that content's no longer fresh, including episodes if they don't need to be listened to as part of a series, because Google's now doing passage ranking. So it will push somebody directly into the middle part of your audio if that answers the question. And whether or not that content is related to contents, categories or topics that are of interest to a particular listener. And across all of this, the audio quality really matters. Google has updated their Google Human Rater guideline to include stuff around audio quality. And they have particularly included general popularity, whether or not the audio quality is good, and whether or not the content's been associated with particularly accurate keywords or categories. And interestingly, your guests will really matter. So in early 2020, Google was granted this patent called speaker identification. And yes, I realize that even though they got a patent doesn't mean they're actually using it in ranking, but we're going to talk about it anyway. And this patent, interestingly, allows them to identify a speaker by using speech recognition. They can do this by honing into the unique aspects of how each speaker communicates. And they're most likely applying this to YouTube videos. But Google also has all this audio data in Google Podcasting, where they could also analyze and ID different speakers. My friend Bill Swalski, who's the one who looks at all of the Google patents and has been for the last 16 years, points that this is actually part of a larger trend that he's been noticing. He says, quote, Google wants to index actual speakers and authors and websites, treating each as an entity, understanding in each of these based upon the features that make them unique, end quote. So if Google knows you're interviewing an expert, they'll apply that expertise to definitely the podcast episode that has the expert on it, but potentially also giving you a little bit of love because you're now associated with an expert that Google understands in a particular topic. Let's talk a little bit about the other bits and pieces that would be relevant for ranking audio content. So there's some basic blocking and tackling here. So if you've got a podcast, you're going to need a dedicated landing page for the overall podcast because Googlebot needs that and needs to have that linked to an RSS feed. The homepage, the RSS feed, and all of the audio files need to be crawlable, accessible by Googlebot. They should not be behind a login. And I would also recommend adding schema markup to the web page on your site, the same as markup, so that Google can also associate you as an expert with that content. Now, each podcast URL will be indexed and ranked separately by Google. And if you're using a major podcasting hosting platform, then you really don't have to worry about much else other than claiming it with Google and registering it with the Google Podcast. But I recommend that for each podcast episode, if you have a podcast website, you should have one. You should have a well-structured page for each podcast episode. So on that podcast episode landing page, there should be well-structured HTML markup, particularly Bing loves that kind of thing. Playable audio, obviously, with the episode length, the date published, show notes, transcripts with timestamps. The timestamps is what helps Google link or send a listener who has a question directly into the inside part of your audio, that particular timestamp moment where their answer appears. So timestamps are important. Key takeaways, checklists, worksheets, any lists of resources or entities, and linking to the entities you mentioned in the episode. And let's talk a little bit more about those transcripts. So the transcript file with the timestamps are super important, especially if you can make sure that they are handcrafted versus auto-generated. Now, when This American Life podcast transcribed their entire audio archive and put the transcripts online, they actually lifted their unique visitors by 6% just by doing that. And additionally, as I'd mentioned, Google needs those timestamps to do passage ranking and sending people deep within your podcast episode. Also, now keep in mind that page load speed is a mobile ranking factor. Will be even more of one next year come May. And so many of your audience, because they're going to be engaging with your podcast via phone, fast page load speed is critical. Now, most of the time, they're probably going to be engaging on a podcast app, but you never know. Folks could be actually coming to your website and playing them there. So I would check to see what your landing pages look like with the page load, the core web vitals, looking at the page load speed, as well as the UX issues. You can use tools like GTmetrix, PageSpeed Insights, Google Lighthouse, and just improve anything that you find there. But ultimately, your podcast audio needs to answer a searcher's question to be surfaced in Google search. And that's where having a script for the interview, where if you can think about actually optimizing your questions to address searchers' issues where possible, that will generate the most chance that Google will lift that part of the interview and surface it in search. So those are your tips for today, a wealth of information about how to optimize your podcast audio. Thanks for listening. Come back tomorrow for another SEO tip.